Water has no respect for property. It has no regard for a family's memories, a business's survival, and it rises where it will. And for too many in our communities across Rutland, Harbour and the South Kesteven villages, it rises again and again and again. In Whissendine, the White Line pub flooded 4 times in 2024 alone. People water skied, it was so deep in the village, although I cannot, of course, condone that. The pub's damage was so severe and so repeated that the insurers, the very people paid to be there when it matters most, walked away. Yolanda and Chris Stevenson, who had spent years running the pub, were left to face the consequences alone. A home, a livelihood and a community hub all under threat. Sometimes the barriers to getting things done leave me quite bereft. In Whissendine, the simple installation of a depth gauge would make a big difference to stop cars driving through when things are flooded. And yet, for the life of me, I cannot get anyone to fund it or agree to it. In Langham, the same homes have flooded every single year since 2024. Properties that barely saw a drop of water in the years before now face a deluge, often coming through their doors as lorries drive belligerently through our flooded streets when they should know better. But no one stops them, because the council repeatedly fails to put up signs shutting the road. Indeed, residents should be empowered, I believe, to put up signs themselves in coordination with local flood response leads. So residents are now spending thousands of pounds on flood defences. Not because they want to, but because they have to. In Tallington, a storm left the sewage system and residents without working toilets or showers. Thankfully, by supporting Philip Sagar and the Tallington Parish Council, we have secured and completed works on the culvert under the railway, which was incredibly difficult to negotiate, and more is planned. Then we have Thurmby Brook, flooded in 2024 and 2025 following the storms, and the impact is still felt today. Then there's the beautiful Braceborough, which suffered horrendly. Then there's Gretford, where I was left at 9 o'clock at night ringing the circus, the real circus, Pinder's Circus in Rutland, who were in Hungary at the time, begging them to help me find portaloos for the village. When Storm Henk struck, the village did not flood, it was engulfed. Some people had to be rescued by boats. People spent nights in rescue centres. And when the waters finally receded, 1/3 of all homes had been severely damaged, and many could not return home for well over a year. Now, these residents can easily be statistics, but we all know that each is a family with their own story. And these are the same communities that are about to have a 1,300-acre solar plant imposed on floodplains right next to their homes. Now, flooding is not unique to my patch, and I'm not trying to claim a monopoly of hardship, but I am here to advocate for solutions. Now, I will gently say to members, as much as I love to have an audience for my adjournment debate, we must recognise that I do need to get through everything, but I will quickly give way, and then, of course, I will give way to the gentleman.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Constituents of mine in Moorland and Fordgate live under constant threat of flooding. And this winter they've been very grateful to the frontline workers for the Internal Drainage Board, the Council and the Environment Agency for helping them out. So would she join with me in paying tribute to those frontline workers?
I will happily pay tribute. In fact, it gives me a great opportunity to mention Ben Thornley, who is our local Environment Agency officer. It does not matter when I call him, whether it is an emergency or whether it's proactively trying to make our community safer. He always takes the call, and he has been out to see our communities whenever I ask. So there are people within the system who work incredibly hard, and it's a great opportunity to say thank you to them. Now, every year, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hold flooding summits across the 3 counties that I serve, and every year the story is the same. I will give way to my honourable friend.
First of all, can I commend Honourable for Rutland and Stamford, and she's a very assiduous MP and constituency worker, and we all recognise that the efforts that the Honourable Lady makes in this chamber. Does the Honourable Lady not agree that the smaller numbers of people living in the rural areas can skew sometimes the cost-benefit analysis, and that the Department must take each request not on how many people live in an area and are affected, but the bigger schemes to help the householders, but also, can I say this very gently, to enable farmland to carry out agricultural purposes which are essential for food security for all of this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He is at risk of stealing my sandwiches, so I will briefly get there. But he is right, particularly when it comes to farmers, and I think too often they are overlooked and they do need that support. So the issues that I hear at my flooding summits are that local authorities are too often silent when asked for help, that riparian owners are not taking their duties seriously as they should. Yep. Dredging goes undone, drains go uncleared, and when people from Rutland ask the government for support, we're told we don't qualify. The reason for that is a simple number, 50. To access the flooding recovery framework, 50 houses must flood. Below that line, you get no support. Above that line, here comes the cavalry. But for Leicestershire and Lincolnshire, who I also serve, 50 flooded houses is sadly inachievable and often exceeded threshold. But because Rutland is the smallest county, we have just 41,000 residents, we almost never hit, thankfully, 50 flooded homes. Gretford in Lincolnshire that I serve, remember the 30 houses that were badly damaged. If it had been the only village in Lincolnshire to flood, it would have had no support despite people having to be evacuated by boat and being besieged. There is something deeply wrong with a framework so rigid that those in need of help do not or might not receive support. Now, I raised this objection in the last Parliament and my government then listened, and the Conservative government made sure for the first time ever in 2024 Rutland could access the flood recovery grant. So I'm asking the government to make those changes permanent ahead of the next big floods this year. Because surely support should be on a percentage of the population affected or just those most affected. And accessing this funding would make an enormous difference. I would also ask the Minister to touch on making sure she does provide that support for farmers, because in my community, for example, in the village of Tixover, farmers have had to spend up to £80,000 this year buying food for their sheep who would otherwise just graze off the grass because they cannot get access to their land because it is so flooded. I want to touch also now on insurance. We talk about flood risk in terms of physical damage, infrastructure and recovery time, but there is a financial dimension to all of this that is devastating households, and that is the insurance market. For families in flood risk areas, insurance premiums, where available at all, are eye-watering, and so families have to cover the risk themselves. They hope this year the storm will pass, that the river will hold, the drain will cope, and it never quite does. And a family living in fear is not just flooding is not just living in fear of water, but of the bill that comes in the post. On Flood Re, this was a vital reinsurance scheme established by the last government. But homes built since 2009 are not covered, and the remit will end in 2030, leaving people stuck. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could give us an update on the government's thinking on this. I will give way.
I'm very grateful for giving way and congratulate her on securing this debate. On that point of insurance, I've just come from chairing a meeting with Aviva, a great Norfolk insurer, biggest insurer in the country of houses. And they made the point to me that we are, this is the tip of a major iceberg of uninsurability, unmortgageability, and then unsaleability, and that the Treasury really should be looking at this as a major problem on the balance sheet of this country. A Horizon Post Office scandal, if you like, of its scale and size in terms of serious economic damage to our economy. Would she agree that that elevates this issue to something of national importance?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. I wasn't aware of just how drastic insurers see that situation, but it doesn't surprise me what I see in my communities, and I thank him because I know he has worked consistently on flooding as an issue. So I absolutely take him at his word that we need to be looking at this more seriously. Looking now on dredging, the Environment Agency consistently argues that we should not be dredging their man-made assets, but this position is not supported by landowners and farmers who are the custodians of our land and understand it. It can restore natural water flow, supports better drainage and removes debris, and it should be an option, and so should removing vegetation from EA assets. I will happily give way.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she's making an excellent speech tonight. Does she agree with me that in many cases this is about removing vegetation, but it might also be removing debris like old shopping trolleys or other things that could block a much-loved waterway and cause flooding, and cause an accumulation of debris, and that this is part of the problem? And also that there's an issue of responsibility on landowners and great variation between the way that they manage their land next to rivers.
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right, and riparian ownership, I have to say, is a repeated issue in my community. But also it's devastating to hear that he has things like shopping trolleys in his waterways, and we are very fortunate we have so many local groups who go out and drag anything like that out of the waterways, although it is very rare. But we do need to see action to get those issues resolved. I will very happily.
Can I also commend the Honourable Lady for raising this hugely important topic? And she's right to highlight the importance of local voices. Local voices know best where the flood risks are, they're most at risk, and they have real skin in the game. But often they feel that bodies such as Natural England, or indeed some parts of the Environment Agency, are not responding. Another, particularly in the east of England, in Norfolk, in Cambridgeshire, in Lincolnshire, are the drainage boards, the internal drainage boards. Does she agree with me that we need to see more from the current government in terms of how they're going to work proactively with the drainage boards, particularly around some of the capital funding requirements that they face?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman. I'm in quite an unenviable position where only some of my constituency is covered by an internal drainage board, but that capital is absolutely fundamental, and I'm sure the Minister has heard and will be able to reflect that in her speech, because I was going to ask it later, but I now no longer need to, so I'm very grateful to him. I also want to touch briefly on flood alleviation schemes. We do need strategies to store water better because we are moving from droughts to flood to drought, and actually water resilience and water security should be treated as important as food security. Turning now to planning and development, the government plans to significantly, and I have to say from my own personal view, disproportionately increase the number of homes built in rural areas. All the cities around me have seen significant reductions in how many houses they have to build, and in each of mine, over 100% increase in what is expected, despite us consistently over-delivering on the targets previously set. This has to be done responsibly, and I fear that so much of the building is going to be on floodplains or on the outskirts of small villages whose drainage is only just kept up with modern day life and modern times, and they will find their infrastructure overrun by these additional housing pressures.
Would you give way on that point?
I will happily.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way. She's making an excellent speech and has taken a huge number of interventions, so thank you to her. When it comes to development, flood management strategies aren't taking into account the runoff that additional development will cause. So, for example, the Upper Severn Catchment Management Scheme is looking at opportunities to store water, but it isn't looking at risks from additional development. And we know that the drainage arrangements that are put into place are often not maintained. So things like attenuation ponds aren't maintained into the future. Would she agree with me that we need a better plan for making sure that when development happens, that the runoff doesn't affect the existing residents?
Runoff has unfortunately been a real problem. I only have 3 towns, they're not substantial, but Oakham in particular has seen a real issue with runoff, and that is all from new property, so it does need to be dealt with. And I think it actually turns to the need for incentives and sticks, and new fiduciary financial liabilities would make clear to developers that if you build new homes and in the short term between the next 5 to 15 years there is a significant increase in flooding that was not previously occurring, they should be liable to have to take action to build additional flood preventing aids or go back to the flood defences or drains that they originally built. And that takes me to the planning process itself. I do think it'd be sensible if water companies became statutory consultees in the planning process. Turning now to local councils, a couple of years ago we Conservatives had to force the first ever special meeting of Rutland County Council in its history because the council was not responding on flooding and was insisting that those who had to move out of their homes would have to pay council tax on both their original property and the one they were renting. The council's long overdue Section 19 flooding report has finally been published, but it had very little about what it was going to do to protect us in the future, but instead just focused on telling us all what the problems were, which A, we already knew, but B, given it took them 18 months pretty much since the first flood to report. We'd already had a second flood since then, and we all know our communities and we knew what the issues were. So I do think a statutory limit on how long Section 19 reports can take is necessary, but also they should have to move beyond just setting out the problem to the solutions that are needed. So I'd ask the government to do that, but also to mandate that those who've had to move out of their homes due to flooding should be protected from the cost of covering council tax in 2 properties, because I'm frankly tired of having that fight with my local councils every time we have significant flooding. I want to touch on some of the flooding heroes in our communities. So Phil Britton and the entire Gretford Parish Council and Floodwarden team, they were built and recovered in the most extraordinary way, but they've gone on to be determined to help other communities protect themselves better, and it's so beautiful to see them wanting to share their expertise and plans to others. Richard Besant, Chair of Langham Parish Council, who has advocated and pushed relentlessly on behalf of his village, and Philip Sagar, who I mentioned earlier, the Chair of Tangton Parish Council, who has been a persistent and principled voice for residents who've been facing unavoidable misery. I also obviously touched on Yolanda and Chris Stevenson, who not only fought for their own pub in Whissendine, but the entire community when others would have frankly given up and hidden in a hole. These are just some of the people who've held our community together, and they are remarkable, and I'm so proud to represent them. And there are more that I wish I could name who have stepped up. But it shouldn't be left to those who care passionately to improve our flood defences or respond in emergency. It shouldn't be councillors like Lauren Heckles or Karen Payne who find themselves out in the dark, deeply trying to get to the bottom. I mean, in Whitwell, we literally have people putting on scuba gear, diving down to the bottom of the water. That's how deep it was, to try and get things out of the drains to get the water moving. And it also shouldn't be left to farmers, who are often our first responders, and flood wardens, who stand in the breach because the authorities simply haven't responded. So let me be clear about what I'm asking. I was disappointed that our communities have been excluded from the funds that were announced overnight, and so I'd be grateful if the government could revisit this decision, because I cannot believe that we are not some of the worst affected communities in the country, not least from the conversations I have with the Environment Agency. The government should do more to support local flood resilience groups because, as we discussed earlier, our communities know what's best for them. We know where the flooding has happened, for how long, and when there are new patterns. Yeah. On insurance, the flood re-scheme must be updated. And please, can Section 19 reports have far more of a focus on action and a time limit. We need to end the double council tax for victims of flooding and challenge the existing orthodoxy on dredging that is letting our communities down. As I said on developers, we need financial liabilities that ensure developers who build new homes tackle flooding preemptively or are held to account when they have not done it sufficiently. And we need water companies to become statutory consultees in the planning process. And finally, as I've touched on, I want the government to review the flooding recovery framework, specifically the 50-house threshold, because as it stands, it systematically excludes my communities who are incredibly vulnerable. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the heavy rains will come again, and I fear they will come far too soon, and our communities cannot face this challenge alone. Although I've touched on some of the villages that have suffered flooding, we have it in Whitwell, in Whissendine, in Caerby, in Cretan. We have Caerby's beautiful church, Ednam, Braceborough, Ashwell, Stretton, Gloucester, Liddington, Staunton, Wyville, Langham, Tugby, Tallington, Gretford, Barleythorpe Brook. These are all in the last 2 years, and there are far more who've suffered. Rural communities deserve protection, and recovery should not depend on population density and protections for those who can afford the premium. And I suspect, Madam Deputy Speaker, that these are principles that command support across the Chamber, regardless of political alliance. But principles unmatched by policy are just words, and I believe that we in our villages deserve much more than words, and this really is one of our foremost concerns and priorities. So I'm grateful to the Minister for listening to the points that I've raised. She'd be very welcome to come to my next flooding summit. I'll bring 3 counties together if necessary. It may be a shock to their systems, but we would do it if she was willing to come and have those discussions. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing her response. Thank you.